Well, good afternoon, good day. Glad you have decided to join me on this live stream. Waiting for David to get on. Hopefully he can get on here fairly quickly. We're going to be talking about this slogan called Speaking Your Truth. Oprah uses it a lot. I've heard several other people use it a lot, and I just wanted to talk about it today. So we're going to jump in and just have a conversation about this. Hopefully our guest will show up. David Pallmann, he's a great epistemologist. He's been reading tons and tons about this. He's got a really great YouTube channel. So we'll kind of just press on. Hopefully he can be here, and we'll just rock and roll. So a few of the things that I wanted to talk about is, what is this really mean? What does speaking your truth really mean? And I think it could mean several different things. So as I describe some of this, as I go through and talk about some of this, feel free to leave me a comment. Feel free to just let me know that you're here. So I got a couple people watching right now. Fantastic. We're going to be answering some questions at the end about some of the things that we say, and maybe some ways that we can look at this differently and try to come to an understanding of one another and how this is going to work. So making sure that everything is rocking and rolling right here. So YouTube is not receiving enough video to maintain a smooth stream. I'm not sure exactly what that means. It seems like it's working pretty well. Maybe you can let me know if you see it working pretty well, or if there's any issues when it comes to the stream. So right now it seems like we're rocking and rolling and everything is up and running, and that is fantastic. So once again, if you have any questions or comments, go ahead and leave them as we discuss this, me and you, the viewer. So what do I think this means? I think it could mean several different things. I think one of the things that it could mean is that you're just sharing your experience. You're sharing something that happened to you from your point of view. You're sharing what you think a situation happened, and you're kind of giving your thoughts on that. And I think that is good. I think we need to be doing that. I think no matter where we're at in life, no matter what the situation is, we kind of need to be sharing and open to what is actually going on in our lives, our experiences, how we're feeling about them, the emotions that are maybe behind some of those things. And I think that's really good. I think where that can maybe slide into a somewhat of an issue is when our view of something, when we're sharing our experience about something that may be considered like a fact of nature, let's just say. Or I think a better description might be something around like a car accident or a crime or something along those lines, where we're sharing our experience, but then there's other ways to kind of get at the data, perhaps. Oh, David just showed up. There's other ways to get at the data of what's actually going on in that situation. And so we need to be looking at, is this just our view, our experience of what's going on? Or are there other ways other data points that we need to be kind of looking at in this situation? So I think while it's good to say we want to share our experience, while it's good that we can be talking about the ways that we look at things or the way that we experience a certain situation, I think when it comes to some of these kind of deeper questions in life, or when it comes to maybe a situation that has some factual basis or possible factual basis to it, that's where I think we need to add in some other things. So David is here. I'm going to go ahead and switch to that scene. David, so glad that you could join us here. Boom, there he is. David, what is going on, my friend? David, we can't hear you. This is one of the reasons that I love live streams, because live streams have this element of like, what's going to happen next to them? So I can't hear you. I can see you brilliantly. There we go.
Can you hear me?
Yes, now we can hear you. Fantabulous.
All right. Yeah, sorry about that. I got the times all mixed up.
No, that's okay. That's okay, man. I'm so glad that you're here. It's awesome.
Good to be on.
Good to be on. So, David, I was just telling our audience a little bit about this question, speaking your truth, and what that really means. So, man, I am super interested. It's one of the reasons that I wanted to do this live stream with you. I'm super interested in your view. When you hear the term, or you hear a celebrity or even your neighbor say something like, oh, man, just speak your truth, what do you think they mean by that?
Yeah, so it kind of depends on the context, right?
Yeah.
So I think like when Oprah Winfrey, for example, says it, I think like in the context of her saying it, it sounded like she just meant kind of tell your story, but it might betray this kind of idea that some people have that truth can vary from person to person, and so that you just kind of like relativism that seeps in, and so people have this idea that maybe what's true for them is not true for you, or what's true for you might not be true for them. And so I think that's the idea there.
Yeah, I was kind of saying some of the same things. It really depends on that context. Again, if we're talking about just a situation that you've experienced and you're just talking about it and sharing your experience, that's great. We want to be able to do that. But if, I kind of mentioned like a car crash or a crime or, a scientific investigation, is a little bit different. You might need to use some other pieces, other data points in that. So if you were going to sit down with Oprah, let's say, and she said, "Oh, David, I'm so glad to hear that. Man, thank you so much for speaking your truth." How would you respond to her?
I might have to ask her what she means by that, right? Especially if she is saying that perhaps something that is true for me isn't going to be true for other people, then it kind of gets problematic, right? And of course, it depends on what kind of setting that you're in. But if I wanted to go a little more into debate mode, I guess you could say, then I might ask, if I ask her what she means by that, and she were to say, well, what's true for you may not be true for me, maybe a question to ask would be, well, is that true for you, but not for me?
Mm.
Is relativism itself, is that something that just applies to her and not to me? And it seems like she's going to have to come back somewhere to see that things are objective and that truth does apply to that it's not just person relative.
Interesting. Well, yeah, and again, I would agree with you on that statement, and I think that's a really good question to ask to kind of get at this the self refuting nature of kind of that thing. So again, if she's talking in a specific sense about this data point or this story or whether or not this thing actually happened, and she's saying, well, it's true for me, and you come back with that very appropriate question, that would start a pretty interesting dialogue, I think, and a dialogue that I've had several times with people, both on the internet and in person. And I think that that's one of the reasons that I wanted to have this conversation. So have you ever experienced that? Have you ever experienced someone kind of saying something along those lines and you apply that back to them? How does that go?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't happen a whole lot with me just because of the particular groups that I'm in. But back in the day, I would have that happen a little bit more often, right? So, kind of postmodern ideas and relativism, they're not as popular right now as they were maybe like 10, 20 years ago. But no, yeah, you definitely do run into it. And it depends on the person that you're dealing with. But sometimes it's really just important to get a clear idea of what do we even mean by truth, right?
Mm.
Because there's a lot of confusion about that, right? Like I hear even among Christians, people will say things like, well, just the other day, as a matter of fact, somebody asked me, how do you know that the Holy Spirit is true, right? And that is kind of a confused question, in my opinion, because when we say that something is true, at least on the theory of truth that I would embrace, which is known as the correspondence theory of truth, truth is a property of propositions, right? And so the Holy Spirit or God is not a proposition. So it doesn't really make sense to say that like God is true or that the Holy Spirit is true, right?
Okay.
When we say something is true, then we mean that something you could express in a sentence, right?
Hmm.
Sentences of the form, that begin with a that, right? That something is the case. And then if that matches the way reality is, then we would say that that sentence, that thought, that proposition has the property of truth. And so sometimes it's really important to just kind of drill down and get to what do we actually mean by truth? Because if we don't have a clear concept of truth from the start, it becomes very easy to talk past each other.
Okay, so again, this is great. Expand on that a little bit for me. So, truth is a property of propositions in that sense. So, if someone says the Holy Spirit example that you used, you're kind of like, what? That doesn't even make sense. So, give maybe another example of where the propositional nature is really important to the statement on whether or not you can answer true or false to it.
Right. Yeah. So, I mean, did you mean another bad example, or would you prefer a good example?
Either one, whatever you pick.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So maybe a good example would be kind of the classic example that philosophers use is if we say the cat is on the mat, right? That's a proposition because it's describing a state of affairs. And so that statement that the cat is on the mat, it would be true if and only if the cat is on the mat. But we couldn't say that the cat is true, right? Because a cat it's an object, it's an animal, it's not something that can bear the property of truth. So philosophers kind of distinguish between what's known as a truth bearer and a truth maker.
Mm.
And so a truth bearer, that's going to be the proposition. And normally that's a thought, right? It could also be a sentence, but a sentence has what's known as its propositional structure is its derivative, because a sentence is only a proposition because it was first a proposition in the mind of the person who wrote it. So pretty much it's going to be a thought. That's what's called a primary truth bearer, and then something like a sentence is going to be a secondary truth bearer. But the commonality between the sentence and the thought is that they're both propositional. So when something is true or false, it's not an object. It's not a noun, basically.
Okay.
Or a verb or something like that. There has to actually be something that you could express as a sentence there in order for it to be true or false. It just doesn't make sense to say that a cup is true, or that my grandma is true, or that that my computer here is true. These are nonsense statements.
Okay.
So there has to be something that has the capacity to be true. And then it is true if that proposition is actually matching reality. So there's something that makes it true, and that's what's known as the truth maker. So you've got the truth bearer, that's the proposition. You've got the truth maker, that is going to be the fact in reality that corresponds to, or that matches, or that aligns with that proposition. So if the cat is actually sitting on the mat, then the proposition the cat is on the mat, it obtains the property of truth. So that's the basic idea of a correspondence theory of truth.
Okay. No, then that's a really excellent explanation for that. And so I think one of the questions that's on a lot of people's minds, which is, again, the most likely next step, is this: how do you know that is true, right? So, I mean, let's just be honest for a second, and because I know we weren't being honest before, but let's just be honest right now, okay, right? And there's a lot of truth claims kind of coming at us, particularly in society. On this channel, when we're talking about Christianity, people are doubting some of those truth claims. They're doubting whether or not Jesus rose from the dead. They're doubting whether or not homosexuality, acting on homosexuality behaviors is a sin. They're doubting whether or not, critical race theory is something that should or shouldn't be taught in schools, or whether or not systematic racism in America is true. They're doubting a lot of those different pieces. They're doubting whether or not they have to go to church or something like that. And I think those are all really good questions to be asking. And I think one of the things that kind of gets people bogged down is just the amount of questions that are coming at people nowadays. So for you, and you don't necessarily have to deal with any of the kind of social or political things, but for you, how do you go about kind of sorting through some claims? What are some of the things that you ask yourself initially when a claim comes up on Facebook or in a conversation, that you will then start to unpack how you could come to whether or not that is a truth maker or aligns with reality?
Right. Yeah. So that's a good question. And so, kind of what we're getting at there is something that we discussed in a previous episode, which is known as epistemology. Right. You've got what is the case, and that's kind of the field of philosophy of ontology and metaphysics that deals with what is. But the field of epistemology kind of deals with in some ways, the more interesting question of how do we know what is, right? Because it seems like we don't just want to have beliefs that are true, but we actually want to have some justification. We actually want to have some reason for thinking that the belief aligns with reality, right? Because there's a very easy way to believe, have a lot of true beliefs. Just believe everything, right? But then you're also going to incur a lot of false beliefs. And so having a good epistemology is basically having a good methodology of how you can tell which beliefs hook up with reality and which ones do not.
Right.
So last time I was on, I think I discussed a little bit about, I think, how we can kind of have the infallible justification for those sort of what's called a non-inferentially justified belief, or a properly basic belief.
Yep.
But when we want to move beyond that, then we're engaging in what's known as inference. And so I would embrace what's known as evidentialism. I think that the way that we move from one set of data or one set of claims or one set of beliefs to other beliefs is on the basis of evidence. And so whenever a claim comes at you, whenever you just encounter a claim, right? Like let's say Jesus rose from the dead, right?
Yep.
Well, you want to evaluate the evidence for it. Now, there's different types of claims, and so there's going to be different types of evidence, or I shouldn't say claims. Probably there's different types of propositions, and so we should assess those based on evidence. But you're going to have a different type of evidence for a different sort of proposition. So a historical proposition, like that Jesus rose from the dead, well, if that's true, then it's something that happened historically. And so the sort of evidence that you're going to want to evaluate is historical evidence. If I say that aliens live on Mars, that's the sort of thing that you're going to want to have to evaluate maybe scientific evidence for that, because that's a claim about something that would presently be the case, and that science would be the field to study that. So it very much depends on the sort of proposition that's coming at you. You assess basically what is the correct method for how to assess that. There are some claims that we do not have the ability to assess, right? So, for example, if I said that there is like this parallel world out there, right? It's a world that's parallel to ours, but it's invisible, so we can't see it, and it can't causally interact with our own world. There's just no way we can know about something like that, right? So it could be true that this parallel world exists, but we actually don't have any way to assess that, right? Because we can't sense it directly. And if it can't interact with our world, it can't leave any sort of evidence behind. I mean, maybe like God could reveal it to you or something like that, right? But then you're going to, of course, need a method to arrive at God and such. There's no way to like directly assess that sort of claim. So there are, I think, some sorts of claims that we don't have the ability to assess.
Right.
But in general, you're going to want to figure out what type of proposition you're dealing with, and then basically use the tools from that field. So again, just as an example, history, right? History, we can use archaeological evidence, or we can use testimony from people who are in the past.
Yep.
We can test the reliability of that, and so a historical claim, that's kind of the way you're gonna want to assess it. It's basically you look at the evidence.
Well, that's good. So let's ruffle some feathers a little bit here, because we've been pretty just like on the level, right? Just pretty milquetoast so far. So for you, and I read your Facebook posts, and I think you and I are going to agree on this. This is why I wanted to ask this question. So if God told you something, if God revealed something to you specifically, what kind of process would you go through in order to kind of look for evidence, if you will, based on what you just said, that was actually the case?
That it's actually the case that God revealed something to me, or that what he revealed to me is true?
Both.
Okay. That's good. So normally, if you could assess that God revealed something to you, then if we understand God to be a perfect being, a being that can't lie, then just if you can establish that God revealed it to you, you've already got a reason to believe it. You don't have to verify it independently. But the question then, I think, is going to be, how do you know that God revealed it to you, right?
Right.
So it's like if you've got a being that that literally cannot lie to you, then and that would know everything, so he can't be mistaken, you would automatically have a reason to believe it if you can establish that God actually revealed it to you. And
exactly.
So there, I think it's going to kind of depend on how God reveals it to you, right?
Okay.
So you've got people who might want to appeal to the Holy Spirit, right? Maybe directly revealing it to them. Well, you'd have to go about that rather differently than how you would from something like, say, the Bible, right? But as Christians, we believe that God primarily reveals himself to us, at least propositions to us, through Scripture. And so it's kind of a question of, can we establish that the Bible is divinely inspired? And so the way that I traditionally would go about that is, you could give arguments for the existence of God. I show that we have some reason to believe that he exists, and I'm sure you've gone over those on the channel before.
Mm-hmm.
And then from there, you can turn to historical evidence, again, for the reliability of the New Testament, for the resurrection of Jesus, and things like that. And because remember that the New Testament, right? Because people want to say, well, you can't use the Bible to prove the Bible. And well, what I mean is you can't assume that the Bible is true to prove it, right?
Right.
But even if we don't assume that God has anything to do with the Bible, we still have a lot of ancient documents here. And, we've got somebody named Matthew, someone named Mark, someone named Luke, someone named John, and someone named Paul, all writing about this guy named Jesus who lived in the first century. So principally, we can assess those claims the same way that we can assess any other ancient claim or ancient testimony in the past. And I think if you subject the New Testament documents to that sort of rigorous testing, then they come up very well. And so then we've got a reason to sort of believe that Jesus is God, that he rose from the dead. And so we would have a reason to believe what he says. And then Jesus will testify to the inspiration and reliability of the Bible. And so that's kind of how I would go about justifying what God tells me from Scripture. It's a bit of a different case if you want to say that God is like directly revealing things to you. Then that is a little more complicated. But at any rate, revelation from the Bible, that's how I would go about it.
Right. And I think I would largely agree with that methodology, kind of in that system. And so, you talked before about, kind of relying on the tools of history. And so that's one element that we would use when we're investigating the Bible. But then there's also things like theology that we'd use that's a little bit outside. It may be, on a Venn diagram, they might overlap just a little bit here and there. But I think when you're talking about theology specifically, those are questions about the nature of God, the nature of man, the nature of the principles that you're communicating, and those are a little bit outside of the historical method. So you might use the historical method to get to the reliability of the document as you described, but then there also might be a sense of, the philosophy of language where you're looking at context of what the language means and what was going on, whether or not you're looking at a certain genre that has a certain kind of thrust to it, a certain type of what it might be saying. And that will help you understand a little bit about what's going on in the text and how you interpret it, how you understand it, but then also how you apply it to your life. So I think that's a really excellent kind of way to kind of start looking at some of those different pieces. Real quick, so just a couple more questions that I think kind of dovetail on some of this. If you were really pressed, and I'm not pressing you, but if you were pressed, right, how would you describe the difference between objective truth and like a subjective truth?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we talk about objective versus subjective, I think it's important to keep in mind that there are actually two different meanings of those that distinction can refer to two different things, right? So on the one hand, if we say something is objective, we can mean that it's sort of something that like exists independently of anybody's opinion, right? So it's something that's not contingent, not dependent on what anyone thinks, whereas something that is subjective does depend on what somebody thinks, right? And so an example of this might be like so take like vanilla ice cream, right? If we say vanilla ice cream is white, that would be objective, right? Because it just is that way, and it doesn't matter whether anybody knows it, whether anybody believes it. But if we say that vanilla ice cream is good, well, now we're kind of talking about something that's preferential, right? We're saying that I prefer the vanilla ice cream over something else. But it can also mean something that's public versus something that's private. If we say that something is objective, we might mean that it's out there, something that everyone can examine it. And we can also say that something is subjective, then it's private to oneself. And so these are really two very different ways of speaking of objective versus subjective. And I think it's very important to keep them distinct because people will sometimes use them interchangeably and get people to trip up or say things that they don't really mean. And so you really have to be careful there. When we're talking about truth, I actually don't think there's any such thing as subjective truth, even things that are apparently subjectively true, right? So, for example, my father likes chocolate ice cream better than vanilla ice cream. And I like vanilla ice cream better than chocolate ice cream, right? So it seems like it might be subjectively. Tim's just giving me, you're just giving me the no-no look there.
I mean, I'm a chocolate guy myself, but really I prefer cookies and cream, or cookies and cream if you really press
Oh,
me.
okay. You get the best of both worlds.
Yeah.
Well, you can crucify me after the show, but the point is, something like that might seem to be subjective, right? It seems like maybe there's not any truth to the in the matter, right? Like it's not true that chocolate is better than vanilla, or it's not true that vanilla is better than chocolate, right? But notice that it is true, even for my dad, that I prefer vanilla ice cream to chocolate ice cream. And it is true for and it is true even for me that my dad prefers chocolate to vanilla. So even things that seem to be apparently subjectively true, actually, I think turn out to be objectively true when we really look at what that means, right? Because even our preferences, something that is preferential to us, that's still objectively the case for other people. So it's just really important to keep those distinctions clear, I think.
Okay. Well, okay. So the final question I have, so if anybody has comments, feel free to leave them if you have any questions. But the final question that I have, I think comes down, and we'll have to do a little bit of unpacking here, comes down to this idea of like the map and the territory. So what do I mean by that? So I've heard it said several times that because we are humans, we're subjects, right? Everything that we experience about the external world has to be filtered through our filtered through us, filtered through our senses. So anything that we know, we have to kind of hold with a little bit of, grain of salt. It might not be true. It's possibly true, but so then they tend to say things like, well, because we're a subject and all of our knowledge is, filtered through our subject, everything that we know is subjective in that sense. We can only know subjective things, and that's all we basically have. And it's a little bit of a, kind of let's just put our hands up and say, that's true for you, but what's true for me, because what I experience is different. What I have in my head is different. So let's just go our separate ways. So how would you approach something like that?
Okay, so first I'm going to want to go back to the kind of distinction I made earlier between different ways of speaking of objective versus subjective, right?
Great.
So on the one hand, right, we had the idea where what is subjective can simply refer to what is preferential, right? It's just my own idea, or it's my own opinion. And so in that sense, sort of subjectivism would basically be equivalent to relativism, right? Like that there's no fact of the matter. And if that's what somebody means by, saying that because we are subjects, then everything that we know and experience is subjective, well, that would just be false, right? Think of, the perceptions that you have. You don't reason to the conclusion that, you see a red car in front of you, or that you see a green field in front of you. These are things that are immediately apparent to you. They're there whether you acknowledge them, whether you pay attention to them or not. In fact, you probably have to try harder to ignore them.
Right.
But the salient point there is that these are not things that are just contingent upon our own opinions. They are things that are really there, even if they're just like hallucinations, or if they're just we're living in the Matrix or something like that. Whatever explanation you would want to give for why we have these sorts of phenomenological experiences, the point is it is something that's really there. So it's not subjective in that first sense of the word. Now, I did point out that you could also use subjective to mean private to oneself.
Okay.
Now, an experience is private to oneself, right?
Right.
So if we want to say that, all experience is subjective, basically by definition, because we're subjects, I'm okay with that. The question I think that we're going to want to get at, though, is there anything kind of beyond that? Something external to ourselves, something that is public, right? We presumably don't want to live in the Matrix. We don't want to just be the subject of some sort of evil demon or something that gives us dreams, right? No one wants to be the brain in the vat being fed the experiences.
Right.
So it's important to say, if we are talking about subjective in that sense, we're not talking about not real. We're talking about private as opposed to public.
Yeah.
So as far as the epistemology of it goes, I mean, basically you've got kind of two general possibilities. You've got what's known as realism, which is the idea that you've got a real external world of three-dimensional mind-independent objects that impress themselves upon our sensations, and
Yep.
that is what we're perceiving. Or you've got variations on this idea that we're kind of in a dream world, right? So for
Hmm.
Rene Descartes, it was an evil demon. Kind of in the more modern age, it's more of a matrix brain in a vat scenario. How do I know I'm not subject to an evil demon?
Right.
And the way that you get out of that is through an inference to the best explanation. So
Hmm.
when we're assessing different possible explanations, we want to know which one's the best, right? Presumably, we don't want to believe the worst explanation.
Right.
So, one thing that people will appeal to that makes an explanation better is if it is simpler, right? And the
Hmm.
reason why a simpler explanation is better is because there's fewer ways for it to go wrong. So to kind of an illustration of this is imagine if you've got like a stack of several dollar bills, right? Like let's say you've got $100 bills on your dresser, right? And you leave that there and you go to work and then you come home and the window is open and the stack of money is gone. Well, one possibility is that one person broke in and took all the money. And another possibility is that 100 different people all broke in and each one took $1, right? Those are both possibilities.
Yep.
But the best explanation, unless you have independent evidence for thinking that there was more than one person, is you just attribute it to one person. You say that one person broke in and took the money. Why? Because that's a simpler explanation. It's got fewer commitments on your part. There's less you could be wrong about there.
Hmm.
Because if you say there were 100 people that broke in, then you can be wrong 99 times. So the simpler explanation is more likely to be true. In the same way, it's just simpler to say that there is a real external world out there. If you're going to say that a mad scientist has you plugged into a computer system that's giving you false impressions, then that commits you to the existence of this mad scientist. It commits you to the existence of his world. It commits you to the existence of the machine, and it commits you to the existence of
Right.
each and every phony sensation that you're getting.
Hmm.
Uh, there's a lot of ways that hypothesis can go wrong.
Yeah.
Whereas if we say that there are just real mind independent objects, fewer ways that can go wrong. So it's intrinsically more likely that there is a real world out there. And so that's how you get out of kind of the brain in the vat problem. So no, you can't have certainty about that, right? It's always possible, but anything is possible, right? Possibility comes really cheap. We want to believe what's most likely, what is rational. And so that's kind of how you get out of those sorts of skeptical scenarios.
Right. Yeah, I'll add on. That was a fantastic explanation. I'll add on kind of there. I like to break possibility down into kind of three categories. One is logically possible, and anything that isn't a logical contradiction in that sense typically falls into the category of logically possible. So that's kind of the first test that I would use for any claim. The second one is metaphysically possible. Something is metaphysically possible if we can imagine it happening, if we can be thinking about it, if we can create a concept in our brain. It's metaphysically possible. And then the last one is physically possible. And those are things that we would look at, through science, through repetition, through, data and whatnot, whether or not something is physically possible. And then you get into things like, so it's it's not physically possible for me to jump over the Empire State Building. It's metaphysically possible for me to jump over the Empire State Building. It's logically possible for me to jump over the Empire State Building, but it's not physically possible. And so that's kind of how I would narrow those possibilities down. And then you can move into things like likely or probable, or what other evidence do we have to support such a thing. For all three of those other categories, if something is logically possible, then, if something is logically impossible, to me, we don't need to investigate it at all. That's a non-starter. We don't have to go down that road. If it's logically impossible, forget it. So yeah, would you agree with those kind of three categories there?
I would. I think so. As far as the metaphysically possible one that you mentioned there, I think some philosophers will refer to that as epistemically possible, but
Sure.
that sounds like those are probably just two different ways of describing the same things. But yes, as far as the three categories go, yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah. Well, David, thank you so much for being here. Tell us a little bit about your channel here at the end. I was going to have you do it at the beginning, but we kind of jumped on and I just got started. So I apologize for that. That's on me. Tell us a little bit about your channel and where people can find you.
Yeah, sure. So I have a YouTube channel. It's called Faith Because of Reason. I do theology, apologetics, sometimes philosophy. And if anyone's interested in my work, then yeah, you can look me up at Faith Because of Reason.
Well, that's fantastic. So, this is another question that I want to end on. What are you reading right now? I see your Facebook posts. It seems like you read a book a day, or if not, then you read like 75 books at one time. So, what are you currently reading today? What's something that you're got your nose in?
I wish I had it here to show you, but I actually left it in the other room. But it's called Hume and the Problem of Miracles, a Solution. It's Michael, I think Michael P. Levine is the author's name. It's the published version of his dissertation, where David Hume offered an argument against being able to rationally believe in miracles. There's a lot of literature on it. He reviews some of the literature in there and basically argues that, yeah, Hume was wrong and you can be rational in believing in miracles.
Interesting. So do you think that you'll do a video on that, kind of laying out some of his thought process and his reasoning at some point in the future? Because I think that's a super interesting question.
I think I probably will do a video on the rationality of belief in miracles, which it's interesting. It's important to remember Hume did not argue that miracles couldn't happen. He argued that even if they happened, you could never be rational in believing in them. So it is actually, it's an interesting argument in that sense.
Yeah.
But yes, I would like to do a video on that someday.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting kind of just thought process to kind of go through with Hume's argument there to say like, okay, well, yeah, the mundane is always more probable than the one-off thing or than the miracle or whatnot. So it's an interesting question. So I'm looking forward to that video. I'm looking forward to how you tackle it. So that'll be fantastic.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Tim, and hopefully the video won't disappoint you when it comes out.
All right. Well, I hope it won't. Trust me. I've watched several of your videos and none of them have disappointed. So, well, man, I hope you enjoyed that conversation that I had with David. He's an extremely intelligent person. Love having the conversations with him about these topics. And I hope it just shed a little bit of insight on how we answer some of these questions, how we know some of these things to be true, and how we can unpack some of them. Hopefully it gave you a methodology to be able to look into some of this stuff a bit more. This is the second conversation I've had with David, and it's always enlightening. It's always fun. And if you are deconstructing, if you have all these questions about, whether or not Christianity is true, or you're doubting some of those things, and you're wondering, man, how can I find answers to some of these questions? Please consider subscribing. Also consider checking out in the description, you can find the link to our Facebook group where we have lots of conversations about several topics that are interesting to people that are deconstructing their faith. With that, thanks for tuning in. We will meet you next time as we deal with deconstruction.